so much for coming to our PLC webinar series number 4. We're going to talk about determining needs and implementing interventions today. First and foremost, we'd like to thank the Vermont AOE for sponsoring this webinar series. They're the reason that we can bring this to you at no cost. We are so happy to have our working relationship with them, and we continue to move forward. There's a lot of information we have here on our site as well. Just so you know, everyone is muted. Please ask questions in the Q&A section of your Zoom. All the resources from this webinar are posted on the Vermont data use page of the Demonstrated Success website, which is a mouthful. We'll show you right where that is. There will be a brief survey at the end of this webinar, like all of the others. Your feedback is appreciated. We look at it, we make changes because of it, and we also have your PD certificate that will be attached at the end of it. So make sure you take a moment to fill that out. And here we go. I'm Heather Jenkins. I will be one of the presenters today. Karen Matzo is also one of the Demonstrated Success contacts for this initiative. And I have my colleague Marissa Hooper here that is also going to be co-presenting today.
Hi, everyone.
All right. For this Vermont Data Initiative, a lot of the work we've been doing throughout the year, there's a few things left. We're doing everything we can to help folks understand about this initiative and using data to help inform instruction and all about your comprehensive assessment systems. It's for everybody K to 12. We're looking at supporting different teams and using assessment to improve your instruction and student outcomes. It's everywhere. And we're going to be working right now through August 2024. When you get the slide deck, there's a little arrow on this Vermont data use slide here. That's the portion of the Demonstrated Success website that has all of the resources and information about this initiative. And you're able to look at all of the resources from the PLC recordings and the assessment workshop and anything you could want to know about this initiative. All right, just the calendar of our learning opportunities. We do have a 2-day assessment literacy workshop coming up on May 8th and 9th. We also have some strategic planning workshops coming up in August. For this whole PLC series, we've had some general understandings that we wanted to make sure of, that everybody is ensuring sort of knowledge of and being able to apply into their particular school or district settings. First and foremost is talking about the fact that professional learning communities are not just about what students are learning, but it's also about us learning as adults and educators, and the work that we put in looking at data and talking with our colleagues about best practices. We also want to make sure that everybody understands the process of the professional learning community and having that specific cycles within our year and what educators are able to do and how each PL cycle works. And then the implementation of those consistent protocols or systems to make sure we have high functioning professional learning communities in our schools. In this particular webinar today, we're going to explore a few different things. The first thing is, how do you determine appropriate supports based on your data outcomes? So we're going to be taking a little bit of a look at data and talking about some scenarios that you might be able to look at to help you understand what to do with your data. We're also going to talk a little bit about best practices with interventions for math and ELA. And then some easy and non-invasive methods for progress monitoring, some different ways that you can do progress monitoring in your classrooms. So the first section here is a review. Some of the feedback that we had received in the past talked about the folks that maybe hadn't seen the first couple of webinars. So we're just going to do a brief overview right here, and then we're going to move on to determining needs. But first and foremost, for the review of PLC and what that means, we explored in the first 3 webinars highly functional teams. We looked at what PLC means and that common definition. We talked about some of the practices to sustain that work and those protocols and routines for communication. We looked at analyzing data and establishing year-long goals and those cycle goals that go along with that. And we just talked in general about creating SMART goals and those different ways in which SMART goals can be created. Last thing, couple things we talked about were initial assessment options and formatting data and analyzing that through the data dive protocol. So just a review, this is where we're talking about what PLCs are. It's interesting, we've talked about PLCs and a lot of schools say, yep, we have PLCs, we meet every certain number of weeks or we meet every week. And I guess we just wanted to make sure to make the distinction between having PLCs as meetings, right? Those tend to be meetings, but PLC is a professional learning community, which means you're creating that culture of collaboration in your school where everybody is able to look at data to achieve higher results for our students and make sure that we're doing everything we can to have them reach our goals. The 3 big ideas of PLC. Number 1 is ensuring that all students learn. The other is that culture of collaboration. So talking with our peers, whether it be about the data, about how to help students, about our instructional practices, and then focusing on those results that we're getting from our students and ensuring that they're able to show their thinking and to apply the skills that they're learning in our classroom to new and novel situations. The 4 driving questions of PLC is, what do we want our students to learn? That is first and foremost what you need to be thinking about anytime you're thinking about instruction or data and results for students. We want to make sure that all of that matches what we want our students to learn, and we know what those outcomes are. The next part is, what are we going to do if they are going to be assessed on it? So we need to know, how do we know if they've learned it? We need to know, what are we going to do if they haven't learned it? And what are we going to do if they have learned it? For this is sort of what I was talking about as that, sort of collaborative culture in our schools. We have a PLC structure. It is not just grade level teams or content level teams. It is everybody in the school working towards a common goal, and all of them having that shared vision of improving student learning and what that means for us. Having those collective commitments, and it's not just my students and your students, it's everybody's students, and making sure we have those goals that we're constantly trying to strive to get to, and to have our students improving along the way. We also talked a little bit about the year-long roadmap. And as we looked at the year-long roadmap, we looked at establishing teams. We looked at the year-long goal, and we did data dives and created those SMART goals. We also then, as we were doing this, we talked about what it meant to have effective teams. So we went through, if you can go to the next one. Yeah, and we went through the 5 components of successful teams. So we need those agreements, those norms to be able to ensure that we're working well together and that we're productive. Those help create that climate of collaboration, and having roles for folks make sure everybody's invested. Any type of protocol that we can use to be able to help us make things predictable and to make things easy to administer or to follow, we want to use those. Again, those shared measurable goals, if we don't have the goals, it's really hard to focus in on exactly how we're going to improve our students' understanding. We have accountability for all folks. We are all part of the gears or the puzzle that needs to be put in place. And then we also have those defined timelines. So we need to make sure we know when things are happening. When are we assessing? When are we looking at data? When do we need to have our information together so that everybody is on the same page and that we're efficient and effective in our data teams. So for the shared, articulated, and measurable goals, they help us with efficacy. They are a way that we continue to be accountable. It creates purpose and is allowed to be revised, right? So if we have something and we realize students are already getting it, or we need to pivot a little bit, we at least have the document, we can revise it at any time, but it needs to exist. We also have action items tied to our goals, and those are able to be fulfilled throughout a particular PLC cycle, and it's tied to those measurable goals. And again, the goals must be meaningful, challenging, and achievable. If we don't have the resources to be able to achieve a specific goal, then we don't want to make it that particular goal. So we want to make sure also that we're being realistic with what our students are able to accomplish, but we're keeping those goals high. And we need to review them frequently and celebrate the smallest and the biggest gains. We talked the last time about types of data. One of them is longitudinal. This helps us make instructional decisions. It's used over a period of time. That's why it's called longitudinal, right? We typically use this data to create SMART goals because we see over certain periods of time, this is how students are performing. So it helps us figure out how to make those goals measurable and relevant. There's different ways to look at longitudinal data. You can look at them for a single grade level over multiple years. So taking a particular cohort of students out of it and just saying, I teach sixth grade, and I'm going to look at how my students perform for the last 3 or 4 years on a particular assessment. It allows me to see where I might be missing some things in my instruction, or that students have misunderstandings. Cohort level historical results, so how students have performed over the last few years, or even just your current year student results. We can look at these over time as well. We also have formative data. So formative data is that data that allows us to see right now, this is how students are doing, and it helps us make instructional decisions. Are students getting it? Are they not getting it? Do we need to spend a little bit more time? Do we move on? And are all students able to access that particular curriculum and the way in which I'm teaching it, so it can help us differentiate? Same sort of ways to look at formative data. We can look at it as a whole grade level. That's the way we would recommend you looking at it. If you have 3 other people who teach your same grade level, or 2 other people, or 1 other person that you might be able to at least speak with, that's the best way to look at it, so that you're looking at it as a whole and you're able to talk about instructional decisions and all of that with your peers. You can also look at it for your own classroom so that you can figure out what you need to do for your students. And then you could look at it also at the intervention or group level. This is the data-driven dialogue. So this is the process that we use to do a data dive. This particular protocol can be used anytime you're looking at data, but it's typically during those larger data dives where you have all hands on deck and you're really parsing out information. We have, for those that are not familiar with this, there's the data-driven dialogue protocol, which is a little bit longer. And then we have the data-driven dialogue short form, which is that template. The next slide, I think, shows the different parts of the long form. So again, just looking through this, all the different phases, we have, sort of relative timeframes on them, making sure that you have a little bit of silent time for those folks that really need to process and look at the data and to be able to formulate their thoughts before you start talking about it. The next one is this data dive short form. So as you're doing the data dive, you are able to record your information and gather the thoughts of not just your own, but of your colleagues as well. Creating SMART goals, again, that's specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. Measurable is the hardest one. How do we measure it? What are we doing? How much do we want students to improve? It's the hardest part of creating SMART goals, but we have a lot of different resources here for the SMART goal worksheet, the creating a SMART goal, and the action steps worksheet for SMART goals as well. Cycle goals. So we talked about creating the year-long goals. This one has to do with students increasing their ability and key ideas and details. So you have a year-long goal, and then your cycle goal relates to that year-long goal and is for a specific amount of time and how much improvement you would like to see over one particular cycle. And you're looking at data again and seeing how they're doing, and then you create another cycle goal from there. When it came to initial assessments, we have a few different options here. Nothing too outside of the norm, but you could use your specific program assessments. You could use nationally normed assessments, teacher created assessments, writing prompts, post assessments from a previous cycle. All of which the biggest piece of criteria is that you know what the success criteria is for the students and you know what outcomes you are expecting for students. Those pre-assessments or initial assessments should match your post-assessments so that you're looking to see growth from the beginning to the end of a PLC cycle. Again, so now what we're doing here, we talked a little bit about the instructional cycle the last time, but we're really going to dive into that now with some of the next sections that we have here for looking at what we do specifically during that instructional cycle. I don't see any questions, so I'll pass it off to Marissa here.
Awesome. So now we're going to talk about determining needs, how we're going to basically take everything that we've learned and now how we can help students. So our PLC model really has us focusing on one year-long goal. So that way we're able to really dial in on that goal, and we don't have so many that we're not able to meet them. So we have our tier 1 instruction. This is going to support our year-long goal. So we can't use the entire tier 1 instruction for the year, just focusing on this goal. We have other things to teach, but we do want to make sure that we are supporting this goal in some way, shape, or form throughout the year. All of our interventions are going to feed into this year-long goal. So we are going to be able to really focus our intervention time on the needs for our students in order to meet this goal. It's important that, we're helping our students really their needs at their different levels, the different levels of their thinking, and we're going to intervene, whether that's in our tier 1 instruction or in our intervention time. We're going to intervene at their specific students' level so we can meet them where they're at. So once again, we're going to quickly go through this process so you can see how this instructional cycle relates to what we've been doing. And we're going to have a math example this time so you can see that as well. So we have our year-long goal, and then we know that our cycle goals are going to feed into this year-long goal. We want to make sure that we have our data. We also have our standards when we're looking at our data. We also have the priority standards. So we know that, we're creating a goal that's really giving us the biggest bang for our buck. And then also our teacher input as well is important to have. So this is just an example of some longitudinal data from historically. We can see over the past few years, really breaking down in math how students have been doing in our tier 1 instruction, breaking down all the clusters of math. We decided that we needed to work on performing operations with multi-digit whole numbers with decimals. Our students have been below the proficiency standard. We want to make sure that our students are at or above the proficiency standard. So this is the goal that we're going to be working on for the year. So we have this year-long goal. Now we need our cycle goals that are going to help us meet that year-long goal. So we're going to start with cycle 1. And this is some current student data. So this was our initial assessment. We figured out our year-long goal. We're giving this initial assessment, and we're seeing how our students are doing in our tier 1 instruction. What do all of our students need? We're taking a look and seeing that, our standards are listed here. We're taking a look at the correct answer frequency for our standards. So we're seeing how the class, again, is doing as a whole. We can definitely see how students are doing individually, but for now, we're putting it all together. So based on these standards, how are our students doing? If we take a look, we can quickly see that these two standards, 5.nbt.2 and 5.nbt.6, seem to be where students are struggling the most as a whole. What we want to do now is make sure that we are looking at our standards so we can figure out, exactly what kinds of questions students were not doing well on. So we bring up our standards, and we're seeing that these are the two standards in which students are struggling. We meet as a PLC team, we discuss both. We determine that, based on our instruction and what we do throughout the year, that really finding whole number quotients or finding, whole number quotients with up to 4-digit dividends and 2-digit divisors is something we want to focus on for the year. So we've created our cycle 1 goal. We want to make sure our students are able to find whole number quotients with up to 4-digit dividends and 2-digit divisors in context. And we're going to do that. We're at 26%. We want to try to make it 90%. That's our goal. We've done all this. We did this with a writing. We did this with reading. We just showed you with math. But now what do we do after we've determined what we want to work on for this first cycle? This was introduced in the first PLC, this instructional cycle, where we're really focusing on how this instructional cycle is relating to those 4 questions that are really what this PLC process is all about. So what do we want our students to learn? We need to make sure that we are establishing those learning objectives. We determine the standard that we want our students to focus on. We need to make sure that we unpack that standard so we really understand exactly what that standard is asking our students. We need to write down essential questions and identify any big ideas within that. We want to make sure that we determine any assessments for our instructional cycle. That can be our common formative assessments that we do as a PLC, our rubrics, so we can determine how students are doing, and any performance assessments. And we want to instruct and assess our students. We want to make sure that we are designing a lesson and reviewing it. We've seen that clearly in the past 3 years, whatever we've been doing to teach this specific standard is not really resonating with students. So we really want to look at the lessons we've given and kind of do a little judge to them and really see what we can do to help students. And we want to make sure we are delivering effective tier 1 instruction. That's really big. And then we will assess our students. And then we have to focus on, what are we going to do if our students haven't learned it? And what are we going to do if they have learned it? Kind of this juggling act with your students, because you could have some in one part and some in another. So we need to make sure that we're interpreting, and analyzing this data that we're given so we know which students have learned it and which students haven't by examining student work. And then we want to make sure that we are adjusting our lessons and instruction, because clearly the first time it didn't work for these students. So they might need some new strategies, some new ways of thinking. We want to instruct and assess again. We want to deliver that effective instruction for those students who need that extra support. And then we want to, for those students who have learned it, we want to examine their student work as well and continue giving them some enrichment opportunities. So that could be moving on or extending, going deeper into the standards, really that DOK level 4, what can we do for them? And then we want to plan for next steps. So we just want to make sure that we're starting with this highly effective research-based core instruction. We want to make sure that our tier one, where we have all of our students, we are really making sure that that's where it all starts, and we're focusing on some highly effective instruction. We want to make sure that we are identifying students, those students who are understanding what we're teaching, and our students who are not necessarily succeeding just yet. We want to be able to systematically identify them. We need to make sure that those students who are not succeeding right now, that we are providing them with additional time and we're giving them that extra support that they need until they're able to master those targets. And then we want to make sure that for those students who already have mastered those targets, that we're extending for them. What we want to push here is that we are all doing this collaboratively. We are working with our colleagues and our PLC teams to do this together. We're sharing ideas. What is working with our students? What's not working with our students? Making sure that we're sharing instruction that we're doing that is working. We are, identifying students together. So this is all peer collaboration. This is our PLC cycle planning sheet that we have in the PLC binder. This is really going to help us figure out how we're going to help students who have learned it and are understanding it, and those students who are not. So we want to make sure the first thing we're doing is breaking apart this standard. We read it in the standards, but we need to either unpack it, really write down those big ideas. What is it asking us? So here's our standard, pretty long. So we want to break it apart. We really want to be able to divide multi-digit numbers using strategies based on place value, properties of operations, and the relationship between multiplication and division. We decide as a PLC, we're really going to focus on these place value strategies to divide multi-digit numbers. This is an example of this planning checklist filled out. So we can see at the top here, we have our cycle goal so that we're always relating back to that. This is what we want our students, where we want our students to be at. And we're making sure that we are not using the traditional algorithm. We are teaching place value strategies. We do not want a memorization of steps. So the first thing we want to start is this whole class differentiated instruction that's related to our data cycle goal in tier one. We know if there's any math teachers here today, we know that we're not teaching one standard or one even cluster of standards the entire year. So how are we going to focus, an entire cycle on this goal? So really this whole class instruction, what are we going to do? We want to dedicate an extra 10 minutes a day to this. It could be a warm-up activity, a closing activity. You could put it as part of, another concept that you're teaching. Who is responsible for this whole class instruction, the teacher, the location, and how are we going to progress monitor how our students are doing with this goal? Maybe we give a weekly exit ticket, a check-in now and then. Maybe we're taking some classroom discussion data and things like that. We then have some small groups that we can break our students into. So maybe it isn't a warm-up every day. Maybe we're spending a little bit of time each day breaking our students into groups. Now, the teacher responsible and location, if you have a co-teaching model and you have, paraeducators in your classroom and you have people that can help, you can put, other teachers responsible so that they know exactly what they need to be doing with their group of students. Sometimes it's only you. So this is an example of it's only you. You have to go to each group and kind of to give that extra help. So what can we do? We can do number talks. We have place value problems. We can really focus on the pictorial, drawings, things like that. And then how we're going to progress monitor our students, the observational data collection. We have some open middle problems and some quick checks. At the bottom, we have intervention and extension related to your data cycle goal, tier 2 and tier 3. These two were focused on more of that intervention piece outside maybe of the classroom. Heather will go into a little bit. Tier 2, we can go into the classroom if we need, but maybe in whatever model you have for MTSS, we can pull them. What are we going to do? Who's responsible? And again, how we're going to progress monitor those students. A quick ELA example, data shows evidence and elaboration is a weakness in writing. We have our year-long goal, which is we need to focus on evidence and elaboration. We then make sure we look at the standards. What does this mean for our grade 4 students with evidence and elaboration with the different types of writing that we have? And then we have our cycle 1 goal. We want to really focus on informational writing. We decided as a PLC. So what does this mean? How are we going to help our students in this instructional cycle? Again, we want to make sure we have that cycle goal there that we're always relating back to. What are we going to do in our tier 1 instruction? Maybe we're working on some writing responses to multiple passages that are informational. We are progress monitoring with weekly responses. And then in our small groups, we want them to find evidence. We want them to determine appropriate evidence and evidence-based writing responses. And we'll use observations and responses to monitor how our students are doing. And get into tier 2 and tier 3. How are we going to help those students who might need that extra support? So we want to make sure that we're figuring out how we're going to, what strategies and activities we're going to use, and the progress monitoring strategy as well. This is also super helpful because if you find something that's working, like if you find a strategy or activity that's working, you can have this documentation that allows you to refer back to, and you're like, oh, let's start determining appropriate evidence. This activity that we did here really worked for our students. So then we have it in our tool belt and can use it in the future. I will look to see if there's any questions. It doesn't seem like there is. If any come up, please ask them in the Q&A.
Okay, so looking at tier 1 supports and tiered interventions. So just a little bit of information here. We're looking at, as we're talking about your multi-tiered systems of support or your framework that you're using, you may call something RTI or response to intervention, win time, what I need, intervention time, intervention block. We're talking about all of it right now. Any additional time in which you can spend on helping students reach an understanding that's needed for a specific skill. So for the tiers of intervention, this is probably not new to very many people, but just to make sure everybody's on the same page, we have our tier 1 or our core classroom instruction that has the most amount of students in it. Then we're targeting and having small group instruction in tier 2. And then tier 3 is that intensive individual instruction. As we're looking at this, both tier 1 and tier 2 can be done in the classroom. For the most part, that tier 3, that intensive individual instruction, needs to be outside of the classroom. As we're looking at the tiers of intervention, we know that as the tiers increase, the level of support increases as well. So as we go up through the tiers, you have the teacher to student ratio goes up. Then if we're looking at the tiers of intervention here, as we're looking at this, these percentages are showing the amount of students within a classroom or a school that should be receiving the different types of intervention. So we wanted to make sure to have this in here, one, because I think these numbers are changing quite dramatically. But best practice says that only 5% of your students should be getting tier 3 instruction. That intensive individualized instruction should just be 5% of your students. For tier 2, that might be an additional about 15% of students that would be getting that targeted small group instruction. And tier 1, where the 80% is, doesn't mean there's only 80% of your students getting tier 1 instruction. 100% of your students get tier 1 instruction. So if students are in tier 2 or tier 3, they need to be in there during your tier 1 instruction time. That tier 2 and tier 3 is on top of what they're getting for that whole group tier 1 instruction. The 80% next to that is that at least 80% of your students should be understanding your tier 1 instruction. Marissa talked about this just a little bit during the last section, in that when we talk about professional learning communities and PLC, we do want to focus on those interventions and those extra supports, but we really need to make sure that we are dialed in for tier 1 instruction, because we have too many students that are needing tier 2 and tier 3. As we start to really improve and collaborate and talk about best practices for tier 1, hopefully those numbers of students in tier 2 and tier 3 will then decrease and go back to within a manageable range. But this is the numbers and percentages for the tiers of instruction, and that should be guidelines for you folks. The types of interventions that we have collaborative interventions, students working together. This is an intervention that can be done right in your class. We're talking about students talking with one another and discussing their thinking, whether it be with a whole group, with small groups, or what have you. So that collaborative intervention, or that collaborative nature of a classroom, should be happening in your tier 1, but it's also a way to do intervention as well. You could do one-to-one, so teachers working intensively with one educator. You could do classroom-based, again, supporting that learning within the classroom. Lots of different ways we can do that. We have behavioral interventions. A lot of what Marissa and I have been talking about with folks in the field and just in general is it's hard to really separate out some of the behaviors that we're seeing from the academic gaps that students have. A lot of the behaviors we are seeing are due to students being frustrated in a classroom or not understanding. But there are also obviously some additional behavioral supports that might be needed. So we tend not to completely separate them out, but we've got some information coming up about it. That social emotional is the same thing. Again, we're looking at making sure that students have that self-awareness, understand social situations, self-management. This has been a challenge recently. And then that peer tutoring, so having pairing students at different levels, pairing them up together. I've talked about this kind of in the past with folks as well. Peer tutoring is great if you don't do it all the time. You don't always want your low students paired with a higher student. That's not necessarily going to be the best thing for your higher student or your lower students either. So use it sparingly, but it is definitely a type of intervention that you can do. Some rules of thumb that we have for intervention. One, whatever you're doing for intervention needs to be research supported or research based. It needs to be based upon things that we know are scaffolds and ways for students to be able to fill those gaps within their learning, and we're not just making it up on our own. This does not, however, mean that you need to provide a program to buy a program for any of this. There are definitely programs out there for RTI and intervention. There's reading programs, there's math programs, writing programs, but you don't need to buy one. Just use what you know is good research-based instructional strategies. Some of those that we have down here on the bottom are using manipulatives, chunking the learning, delivering small group instruction, setting goals and having students monitor their own learning, and rereading for fluency, and in giving students opportunities to increase their fluency. Some helpful resources that we have here, we always like to put links in. The Florida Center for Reading Research and the What Works Clearinghouse are a couple of places that you can go to be able to understand different interventions. The links are right in here, so you can take a peek. They have lots of information about intervention on their websites. When we talk about intervention, we also talk about that part where we said students monitoring their own learning or setting their goals. John Hattie has done, thousands of studies. I'm sure you've heard about him in the past, but there's two indicators that are the biggest indicators for student success and the most amount of student learning that students can gain within a year of instruction. Number one is effective teacher efficacy. So that's PLC. That's working together collaboratively with our peers to figure out how we are going to ensure that all students are learning. Number two is having students monitor their own success and understand the success criterias and outcomes of their learning. So as we're doing our interventions and thinking about interventions and just instruction in general, we want to make sure that we are very clear about what the outcomes are for the learning and why we are doing that particular learning and how it feeds into what students need to know now and in the future. Some types of interventions here, these again are just some general examples of interventions for academic interventions. This is interesting. Marissa and I looked at this, and I meant to update this. I wanted to take flashcards off of tier one, specifically when it comes to math, the skill and drill. Flashcards can be helpful, but these are just to make sure you understand this. Anything that's done in tier one can be done in tier two. And then anything from tier one and tier two can also be done in tier three. So it's kind of like a building block. And these are, again, just some examples. When we're talking about interventions, we want to always be going back to our standards. So we wanted to put our reading anchor standards here. These anchor standards are all the way up through every single grade level. So for ELA, it's pretty easy to see how things build upon one another because they all fall into key ideas and details, craft and structure, integration of knowledge and ideas, and range of reading and text complexity. For focus area and for supports, so if you have an area of concern, we just put here some of the supports that you might be able to use or some of the interventions you might be able to use for those particular areas of concern. Same thing we did for our writing interventions. You've got your area of concern and then supports you might be able to use to be able to help students fill some of the gaps that they have. With math, we're not so lucky. The standards don't follow through every single grade level. So we have key concepts at each grade level that we've put down here up through 8th grade. And then there's also a progression for high school as well. But we just wanted to show you what some of those focus areas are for each grade level for math. And then when it comes to an area of concern on the left and some of those supports on the right-hand side. For math, the supports are kind of a little bit more broad. So we have them all gathered on the right-hand side and then some of those areas of concern on the left. The biggest thing that I want you to take away from that math portion here is that you will see there are a lot of manipulatives. One of the biggest things that we see with math is manipulatives stop being used for the most part in 3rd grade. Sometimes people in 4th and 5th grade use them or they bring them out for fractions in some upper grades. But manipulatives should be used at every single grade level from K to 12. It's modeling, it's showing people and having them see what we're talking about. So I just want to put out a little plug there for manipulatives and making sure that even in the upper grades that you're using them. Then we have SEL and behavioral interventions. Again, here are some of those areas of concerns and things that you can do for supports within your intervention time.
Okay, I don't see any questions. So we're going to head into the last part here, progress monitoring method. So how are we going to make sure that we know how students are doing? We want to talk about what is progress monitoring. So we had this in our the instructional planning when we talked about what are the strategies and activities we're going to use, and then how are we going to progress monitor students. This is just really a systematic form of assessment. And what we're doing is we are evaluating student learning and we're doing it consistently. So we're doing it on a frequent and repeated basis. So we can kind of think of it as like our formative assessments. You know, we're consistently seeing how students are doing. So that way we are able to evaluate if they're understanding, which really is evaluating the effectiveness of our instruction and our intervention strategies. Is this working? Is this not? We don't want to spend weeks on an intervention strategy if students are not grasping the concepts. Progress monitoring is done throughout the 6 to 8 week PLC cycle. So when we're in our cycles, we want to make sure that we are progress monitoring not only with our classroom instruction, but also these interventions that we're giving our students for our goals. How are they doing with it? So when we are progress monitoring in an intervention cycle, we need to make sure we're doing this at regular intervals. We want to make sure we have a plan. We're not going 2 weeks without doing it and noticing that students are not grasping anything we're teaching. We want it to be as non-invasive as possible. It should not take up our entire intervention time or class period. We want to keep it short for both students and for ourselves. The more work they do means the more work we have to do to grade it, which then takes away from our instruction. We want to make sure we are recording and charting the progress monitoring. So we need to make sure we're keeping track of how our students are doing. And we'll go into some of these in just a second that we can show you how to do. We also want to make sure that we are specifically targeting the skills that we are reteaching, making sure that this progress monitoring isn't kind of encompassing everything. We just want it to be, what are we reteaching? What is the intervention? That's the skill we want to monitor. We want to make sure it's easy to implement for both the students and ourselves. And we want to make sure that it's changeable depending on student performance. And what we mean by this is that depending on how our students are doing, we need to change what we're doing, right? The effectiveness of our instruction and interventions. This is fluid, so it can change, and it's all going to be based on that student performance. What progress monitoring might look like in either your classroom or an intervention room. We could have 1 minute running records. We could also have fluency checks in math or reading. These, if you even, want to search the internet, so many resources come up for these. A few targeted problems based on specific skills, definitely defined by your goals for intervention. So we want to make sure that, we're keeping it small. We can just ask a few problems based on these skills. That could be our progress monitor tool. If we're doing some writing, it could be some work samples from students, their writing prompts. Some small group work, where you can collect their work that they're doing in their small groups. So collect that data on how students are doing. Also conferencing one-to-one with your students and taking observational notes. And you can also do this as a class discussion as well. So any sort of conferencing, that anecdotal data is just as important as well. So where we can find progress monitoring tools and information. These are some resources for you. We have Easy CBM. This is a free version. It does have progress monitoring measures. You can enter student data, use reports, everything like that. We also have the RTI Action Network. This has some free resources. You can choose the grades bands, and it has information on progress monitoring and data collection. We also have the Institute of Educational Sciences. This has a lot of research in it as well. And some other online tools that have built-in progress monitoring already. You might be using some of them. We have IXL. This can be done with math, ELA, social studies, and science. Edmentum. This has all subjects as well that you can use. Alex, just math, and then accelerated math and reading. We have EdSurge. So these are just some tools or resources that you can use to help progress monitor in your classroom. Some of them are great because they grade it themselves. So you can just look at a report and see how a student's doing. This is a charting example that we talked about. This just shows, if for one of our students, a progress monitoring chart, what is the area of concern? What is that intervention that we're really focusing on? And what are the dates that we're giving this, this check-in for our student? And then charting how they're doing so that we can hopefully see, growth in our student. And if we're not, then, we need to switch up what we're doing. This is an example of some graphing that we can do for really the weeks of instruction. The time is this example. And then student performance. Again, wanting to see growth in some sort of way. So we know that what we're doing for our instruction and interventions is working. We can also have conferencing with students. This is a nice checklist. So it allows you to quickly, like we said, we want this to be sort of a quick, easy to implement type of progress monitoring. So we can just really, what's our focus? Maybe we want to focus on, we are respecting the opinion of others. So what are some notes that you're having in that conference, and what will your future focus be depending on that? This is a charting example for something that a student can do. As Heather stated, it's really important that students know where they're at in their learning. They know what they need to be successful. So this is a reading charting example. Their fluency progress, they can chart exactly how they're doing, making sure that we set it up for them where we have the dates or the books, whatever it may be, but they can easily access so they can see how they're doing as well. And again, we just wanted to pull back together with this instructional cycle. This is really what we were all about today, is this interpreting and planning intervention. How can we use data to help us? We really want to make sure we're focusing on our tier 1 instruction. What are we doing there? And that can be different depending on what subject level you teach. And then for students who are not understanding in our tier 1 instruction, how are we going to support them and meet them at their needs, all in relation to this year-long goal? Then once we have all these strategies and activities that we know work, we can have that in our pocket, focus on a new goal for the next year. Just a reminder, this is the PLC binder. It is linked here, so you can link it. It has the Google Docs as well as the PDFs, so you can have access to all of the documents that we've done throughout this or talked about throughout this entire series. It also goes in order in which kind of our year-long roadmap goes in, establishing those teams, doing that year-long goal data dive, focusing on our SMART goal cycle goals, and then the instructional cycle and wrap up. So they go in that order if you have any kind of questions about, you know, what comes first. This finishes up our PLC4 webinar series. So we want to make sure that if there's anything that you missed that you wished you learned about or anything, we can always reach out with some more information if needed. And I want to thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much.